Hey, this is Jacob Eben. Thanks for tuning in. There's a subject that's been on my mind for a while now that relates to faith and belief and observance, and I think it could have an important influence on our mindset going into the future, and that is the subject of expectations. I had intended to go into this with my Strengthening Your Faith video, possibly as a part 2 to that video, but now I'm thinking maybe it is a good time to go into this subject of faith and expectations, that it might be useful because either recent events or events over the past several years, those things have become a concern to certain people, and so I wanted to address certain aspects of this that could be productive. And when I'm referring to expectations, primarily what I'm referring to is presuming to know what God has planned, presuming to know what Elohim is going to do, especially in the short term. And I thought it might be useful to start out by going into kind of an outside field, because there's something I'm involved in outside of Torah study, outside of this channel, which I don't really normally talk about, but I thought I would go into at least vaguely, because it has been apparent in that field also that there are similar things which are going on that people also are not recognizing. In that field, it involves a lot of data analysis, a lot of statistics, and assessing statistics and creating models based upon that. And as a result of the models, effectively there are predictions which are being made, and something which is also involved is randomness. And whenever there is a lot of randomness at play, whenever there are a lot of things going on that not all of it is actually important to pay attention to, and yet people feel under pressure and they're also trying to create and use their models, their predictions, it really ends up messing with the mind. It ends up making people unable to see what is really going on. People in this field often become very attached to their predictions, to their models, and oftentimes, even though other people from the outside would say that prediction was clearly wrong, the prediction has failed, you should just move on from it, they're often the last people that move on from it, the people that are in it, the people that developed those predictions. And sometimes there is a legitimate reason for that. People on the outside often don't account for randomness, and people on the outside often don't account for the full picture because they simply don't know it. They don't know what went into the assessment and all of this. But on the other hand, the person who made the prediction has also often lost sight of what is going on by that point. Whenever the prediction may have been going the wrong way, and maybe it's time to reevaluate, the person often is not willing to do that, and instead they are more convinced than ever. And say that such a person does finally realize that, okay, maybe I was wrong about this, whenever they're assessing their overall view of things, they often do not realize when there is an underlying problem with what they've been doing. They often don't realize that there's something going on in their mind that is affecting their thinking and that is creating these bad models. And instead, it's easy to blame it on, well, there's just this one little factor I didn't account for, and that may be totally irrelevant. In the scheme of things, that may be totally irrelevant because whenever you're looking at statistics, whenever you're looking at data, you can cherry pick what you want to see. You can look at certain things and say, this isn't relevant because of such and such factor, and if I just look at this amount of data, my prediction is sound. Our minds are very good at playing tricks on us in that way. It's often very difficult to take a step back and to really introspect, to really assess what we are thinking, how we are thinking, what we are doing as a result. And so how might that apply when it comes to issues of faith, issues of theology, and presuming to know what God has planned, especially in the short term? And there are two general categories of that which I want to get into in this video. And the first one is the belief that in the very near future that the Messiah is going to come, whether that be from the Christian belief of a second coming, or whether that's from a Jewish traditional belief in the mashiach coming to fix everything. And specifically, I'm talking about the idea that that's going to take place imminently. And the second category I want to go into is going to be doubting because a person was very certain that the person knew what God should do in some circumstance, and then something bad ends up happening instead. So with regard to the waiting for Messiah and expecting Messiah to come soon and all of that, I was raised in a Protestant Christian environment, and I was brought up in that belief. And one thing that I noticed frequently along the way is a belief almost continually that the return of the Messiah is very near. The second coming is very near. And I remember along the way that people had picked out specific dates or specific years for when the second coming was supposed to take place, and they were using numerological codes and all sorts of things like that. And whenever it turned out that they were wrong, it was just, oh, okay, well, I didn't account for this. I need to refigure what the date is, and there'd be a new date oftentimes. And then I remember specific points in time where I overheard people talking about how they were convinced that it was very soon, that it was very near, and going to happen any day now, sort of thing. And on the one hand, I can understand why that would take place. And I can understand why a person would, for example, make an estimation or a prediction, not a prediction in the sense of like a prophecy, but a prediction just in terms of their own estimation and their own expectation of what's going to go on. And then that just turns out to not be right, even though they were trying to use the information that they had available to them and the information which they held a belief in at that time. And I also understand how a person could take what is going on in the environment and just compare it with their overall assumptions and their overall expectations for the future, and then see that it looks like what they would expect to happen. And seeing that, for example, the events over the past, depending on how you're measuring it, the past 15 years or the past 7 years or whatever the case may be, a person looking at that and then thinking that this looks like what I would expect to happen before the Messiah comes, and so the conclusion might be that yes, indeed, that is what is taking place according to that presumption. And there are a couple of different things about that which might be worth thinking about, and which I personally would wonder about. For example, what about leading into World War II? What were people thinking then, especially from the Jewish angle? I'm sure that there had to be a belief, at least among those that believed in anything, I am sure that there had to be a belief that any day now it's going to happen and everything's going to be fixed. And just going back beyond that, going back further into the past, there have been many large wars, there have been many disasters, many terrible things that have happened, many plagues where many, many people died, unimaginable numbers of people died. And so I'm sure that at least on some scale, there were people thinking that now has to be the time. It has to be the time now. And something which concerns me about that overall view is that it discourages action. It discourages planning ahead for anything bad. Maybe not inherent to the view itself, but usually accompanying that view, there's often this inherent belief that a person can just get by without really doing anything about the thing which they see as bad. And the belief going along with that is that the Messiah will come imminently and is going to fix that situation, is going to fix everything in one way or another. And so that promotes this lack of thought for the future beyond whatever is going on immediately, because it takes all the agency away, and it can make any action that we could possibly take now regarding any kind of future possible situation, it could make that seem less important and less relevant. And instead, it has the potential to just perpetuate us living like we've always lived, and just waiting until that's no longer possible. And in the case that that actually does come, in the case that we saw that there was a potential bad event taking place and then it does escalate into something bad, if we have waited until there is no longer any possibility of doing anything, then all that is left at that point is just hoping that it will be resolved by God in the way that we are assuming. I can't help but recognize that when looking at various past events, various past terrible events, that using that strategy would have been very bad for the person that was relying on it. That I'm not saying to not rely on God. I'm certainly not saying that. What I am saying is that it can be an issue to assume we know the plans that he has laid. And for me, whenever I think about these things, I don't necessarily hold a typical view on these subjects. And for me, even though I believe that things are going to work out in the end, I do believe that God is effectively going to cause things to work out toward a certain end. That on the other hand, I believe that what people are doing along the way is going to be very important in that, and that action, individual action, is something which does matter. Because on the one hand, we don't know the future, we don't know what plans he has laid, and on the other hand, knowing what has gone on before, we know that action is important. And it's very easy to see that just by reading through the narrative in the Torah. Just reading Exodus 17 as one of many examples, things did not go just perfectly, even though God was with them, even though Elohim was with them, they still had to take action. And you can look at what goes on in that passage, how some bad things take place and how people had to respond to it with actual decisive, physical, individual, and communal action. And the other general category of this that I want to get into, this is something that everyone has come to terms with on some level in their lives, but sometimes it reappears in a way that seems more important to a person depending on the circumstance, and that is not being willing to accept that God allows bad things to happen. And this can come in various forms, but the main belief, which I think is at play, is that a person assumes that he or she knows what God should do. A person assumes that God is a certain way, therefore God is surely going to do a certain thing in this situation. And one example that I've witnessed is that a person knew someone who was very faithful and they had a painful, fatal disease. And the fact that the person died, the other person, the person that had the belief that he knew what God should do in that circumstance and that God would do it surely, whenever that didn't come to take place, he lost faith altogether. And there are a lot of examples of this also in the narrative of the Torah, examples where the people came out and then they were hungry, there wasn't water, there wasn't food, and they just started doubting everything. Even though they thought it was great that they were brought out of slavery and they were leaving and they were going to this land that had been promised to them, even though there was that going on, whenever things got tough, and obviously they became very difficult at times, even despite miracles, even despite other things going on. At times that led to them just doubting altogether, wishing that they would go back into slavery and reject everything that had come up to that point. It can be easy for a person to doubt because we were so certain of what we thought God should do, so that we lose sight of the fact that it actually might have been our understanding that was the problem, not what took place, not what God did or did not do, that maybe it was our understanding and our awareness. And for people that have gone through some type of situation similar to this, whether it be thinking that we knew what God was going to do at some certain time, or thinking that we knew what God should do in certain situations, whenever that person either just maintains their faith because it didn't really hit them too hard, or maybe they recover their faith after going through some period of doubt, what then seems to go on a lot of times is either the person kind of drifts into becoming slightly more apathetic, or the person just continues with the practice they were doing before, with predicting or assuming to know, presuming to know what God has planned. In some cases, we may artificially recognize a quote-unquote mistake from our previous prediction, and of course this is after the fact, after the prediction didn't come out the way we expected. We may recognize that, oh, this was the problem, and that may be completely artificial. That may not be meaningful whatsoever. We rarely recognize that what we need to learn maybe is that we need to do something different in the future, not that we need to improve the prediction using the same thinking that we had before. In my view, the more useful thing to recognize is that we just need to be more careful about our predictions, that we need to learn from this behavior, not in the pursuit of making a new prediction, but in the pursuit of balancing our expectations. that it is safer to be aware of our limitations, the limitations of our mind and our psychology, and to balance those expectations. And what do I mean by balancing expectations? Of course, there's this old adage of hoping for the best and preparing for the worst, but just for a very basic example, say there's a situation where there are two possible outcomes, only two possible outcomes, and we know exactly what it's going to be like with those two. So maybe in an agricultural setting in the past, the example might be we're either going to get rain in time to water the crops and to keep them from dying, or we're not going to get rain in time and the crops are going to die. In that situation, how I would approach balancing expectations is I would recognize that I'm probably imagining what I want to happen, or I'm imagining what I'm afraid of. And then I would imagine the other one at the same time. I would imagine them side by side in my mind. I would work to imagine them both in the same level of detail, in the same size, in the same way as I'm imagining the other one. And importantly, I would keep them both together in my mind. And I would suggest that if you can see situations in the past where maybe it would have been more useful to have different expectations or a balanced expectation, then I would suggest playing with this. I would suggest trying it out. You can even try it out with something that has already taken place. And a lot of people probably are already doing this naturally or have done it naturally so far. And whether you have or not, after you've thought about it for a while, you might consider that rarely is a situation such that there are only two outcomes. There are often nearly an infinite number of potential outcomes for a situation just based upon maybe, for example, with the rain one, there could be different degrees of rain, there could be different degrees of yield from the crops or what might be done in response to that and how that turns out. There could be different outcomes on down the road also that could affect that. So the number of potential outcomes, the number of possible expectations here is usually going to be greater than two possible scenarios. But the same thing could be done in response to that as with the simple example, just having 4 or however many instead of just 2. And I think this could be very useful going into the future because just looking at the narrative of the Torah, it's clear that this was a problem all along with the people in the wilderness. And I do not believe that we have just arisen above that. I do not believe that we are any different really now from how we were back then. And so just like it is reiterated repeatedly in Deuteronomy, I think it's important to guard ourselves in this regard as well. That it is useful to recognize that we don't know what God has planned, even if we have certain expectations for the overall future as far as the ultimate end of all things. On the other hand, we don't know his timing, we don't know the specifics of his plans, and that could have a real impact on some people. That will have a real impact on some people going into the future. And so we have to guard ourselves and help others to guard themselves in that regard. So those are my thoughts for now on this subject. I hope this has been useful. I hope it generates some useful thought and some useful actions as a result. Thanks for watching. Guard the commands, stay focused, and be tenacious.